Hei og velkommen til denne direktesendingen fra Med Israel for fred. Det årets andre arbeidsdag og årets andre direktesending. Og hovedsaken i denne sendingen blir et intervju som jeg hadde med David Weinberg litt tidligere i dag. Weinberg visepresident og forsker ved Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Han har vært en av israelerne som nå med på å åpne relasjonene med emiratiske ledere på høyt nivå, og om kort tid så vil du da høre intervjuet som jeg hadde med han, og der han forteller om et besøk som han hadde i Emiratene for kort tid siden, tilbake i desember. Men først noen av de siste nyhetene. Det som mange MIF-seere sikkert vil være veldig glad for å høre, at Israel nå planlegger å åpne for turister igjen fra april måned. Israel besluttet å stenge grensene for turister i begynnelsen av mars 2020, da koronapandemien begynte for alvor å spre seg, og siden har landet vært lukket for utenlandske turister. Men nå kan grensene igjen åpnes, ser det ut som. Som MIF har skrevet om, og som har fått internasjonal oppmerksomhet, så Israel nå verdensledende i vaksinasjonskappløpet. Og det bringer meg over på den andre saken. Nå har jo dette at Israel har kommet så langt med vaksinering, og Norge sammenlignet så veldig kort, det vekker spørsmål fra norske journalister. Og både statsminister Erna Solberg og Arbeiderpartiets leder Jonas Gahr Støre har uttalt seg om dette de siste dagene. NRK spurte de hvorfor går det så tregt i Norge når israelerne har fått dette til så bra. Ingen av de to politikerne bruker anledningen til å gi ros til Israel. Tvert imot så stiller de spørsmålstegn ved Israels strategi. Så har Israel vært heldige ved at de fikk vaksine tidlig, men de kunne satset på feil produsent og måtte vente lenger, sier statsministeren til NRK. Og Støre, han ikke noe bedre. Han sier at Israel har gamblet, og de har vært heldige. Sitat det som følger: Israel satte alt på en hest og traff på den. Vi har vært med på et større prosjekt som jeg tror vil sikre vaksinene, men det kapasiteten til å sette dem, og at de når de viktige gruppene som viktig. Men dette altså ikke riktig. Det som Solberg antyder, og som Støre påstår, at Israel satser bare på en vaksineprodusent. Så fort vaksinen til Pfizer viste svært lovende resultater, så startet Israel forhandlinger med det farmasøytiske selskapet, men de gikk også inn avtaler med andre vaksineprodusenter. Israel kjøpte 8 millioner doser fra Pfizer, 6 millioner doser fra Moderna og 10 millioner doser fra AstraZeneca, til sammen 24 millioner vaksinedoser for en befolkning på i underkant av 10 millioner. Så ikke bra at norske politikere på denne måten feilinformerer. Men vi skal altså gå til mitt intervju med David Weinberg. Vær så god. So we are happy now to be joined by David Weinberg. He just returned to Israel from an amazing trip to Dubai. And David, what was your main takeaways?
It was thrilling and exciting, Conrad, to visit Dubai as an Israeli, as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew. The speed with which Israeli ties to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have taken off is amazing. And the absolute warmth in which we were greeted in the Gulf, the absolute warmth that every Israeli business delegation, every tourist group has been greeted is astounding. It's a whirlwind, lightning peace bonanza of almost biblical proportions.
What was the background of you going there?
I went with a tour group, a global Jewish English-speaking tour group that brought Jews from all over the world, from the United States, from England, Switzerland, South Africa, Australia, Israel, and other countries together. Mm-hmm. And it was an intellectual tour where we went not only to see the sights and climb the Burj Khalifa to the 124th floor in Dubai, but also to meet with Emirati thought leaders, community leaders, and start a real dialogue.
So was all this set up after the Abraham Accords first was announced in like mid-August, or?
Exactly. I was sitting at an outdoor swimming pool with a friend of mine named David Wallace when the Accords were announced, and we looked at each other and said, we need to do something. He's a tour operator. And with his organizational skills and a little bit of my assistance on the programming side, the intellectual programming side, we were able to put together a fascinating program. And there are additional groups scheduled to go in February and in March and in April, and then again in the fall.
That's amazing. And like tens of thousands of Israelis have already visited the Emirates. And do they all have a good experience?
I think the answer is yes. There were, they say, anywhere between 40 and 70,000 Israelis there over the Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's vacation period. There were some days I heard more Hebrew being spoken on the streets of Dubai than I heard Arabic. But the mix was amazing. There are already 5 hotels in Dubai that offer kosher food to Jewish and Israeli travelers. There are several synagogues that have begun operating. And as I said, it was comfortable, very comfortable to walk the streets of Dubai. Perhaps more comfortable for an Israeli and a Jew to be walking the streets of Dubai than it would have been for an Israeli and Jew to be walking the streets of Paris, Berlin, London, or even New York these days.
Or Oslo. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. You have written several columns after your visit, and I have been struck with the real optimism that you bring out. I haven't known you as a great peace optimist in the past, although you think that Israel will win in the end. How do you think this will affect even the relations with the Palestinians?
Okay, so you're right, Conrad, that many people who've read my articles before traveling to Dubai and especially afterwards have been rolling their eyes in disbelief. You know, Israelis are conditioned to know and hear only bitterness coming from the Arab world, from our Arab neighbors. They have a narrative of self-pity and bitterness and anger, which is marked by complaints against Israel, false allegations, even glorification of violence against Israel. And nevertheless, I am persuaded that the Emirati and Bahraini pursuit of peace, Moroccans as well, is genuine. It is backed by a discourse of religious moderation and broad-mindedness that is deep and admirable, and that goes back some 20, 25 years now. And therefore, it is incredibly hopeful, and I am encouraged. You're right, I've never been a acolyte of what's known here in Israel as the Peace Now School of Faith in the Palestinians as a reliable partner for Israel in guaranteeing peace and security west of the Jordan River. But the Emiratis are different. The Bahrainis are different. It's a distinctive type of Arab Muslim. And they not only want to reap the advantages of partnership with Israel in the security, in the defense, in the technology, and in other economic fields, they also want to redefine the self-identity and image of an Arab, of a Muslim, in a way that blends enlightenment and tradition. And in that regard, Israel's a natural partner for them, because in many ways that's what the people of Israel are seeking to do, to blend tradition with modernity, with enlightenment. And therefore we fit perfectly into their broader intra-Arab agenda. And therefore, I think this peace is real and sustainable because, as I said, it's both about state-to-state interests and regional strategic interests, and it's also about an internal dialogue within the Arab world where partnering with Israel makes a real statement about the direction they want to go. Now, you ask, how could this and might this influence other parts of the Arab world? And here I am also cautiously optimistic. I think there are many ways in which the peace with Israel signed by the four states, Sudan is a fourth state as well, can bring about a change in attitudes in the broader Arab world. I mean, the first and most obvious way is simply by succeeding. The more other Arab countries and peoples see the real benefits of peace with Israel, the more other states will be encouraged to go forward. Second of all, there are school curriculums emphasizing religious and ethnic tolerance and the value of scientific and critical humanistic thinking that the Emiratis have developed and run in their schools. They're now talking about offering these through distance learning to the broader Arab world. I mean, obviously that's a process that will take time, maybe decades till it sinks in, but it's nevertheless the right direction.
Hopefully the Palestinians can pick up some of those books.
Exactly, as opposed to being taught to hate Israel and Jews in UN schools that operate in Palestinian areas. Let them take some distance learning courses from the Emiratis. But even in a more short-term form, there are a number of, as you know, there are dozens and dozens of anti-Israel resolutions passed sort of automatically in the UN every year. If the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, the Sudanese, and maybe even the Saudis begin to shift their vote on some of these resolutions, at least to an abstention, if not to a full no vote, that will send a signal to the Palestinians that they cannot remain 100% rejectionists forever, or they will lose Arab world support and eventually world support. I mean, there are disgraceful resolutions that deny Jewish connection to Jerusalem and call the Temple Mount a Muslim holy shrine only, or that accuse Israel of responsibility for some oil spill off the Gulf of Lebanon 20 years ago, or the talk about Israel poisoning the wells in the West Bank. I mean, ridiculous stuff that long ago should have fallen by the wayside. And therefore, there are many ways in which the Gulf Arabs can usefully seek to move the Palestinians and Israel's other immediate Arab neighbors towards moderation and maturity. I remain hopeful.
Yeah, at least, the signal effects and the symbolism is so important. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Kingdom of Morocco's ambassador to Norway had a Zoom interview with me, like a Zionist leader in Norway, openly. And I would never happen 10 or 15 years ago, for sure. And I believe this will have also a strong impact in fighting anti-Semitism in Europe in general and in Norway, when immigrants from Morocco or other Arab countries see that their former home country makes diplomatic relations with Israel, it will, I think, reduce the hatred towards Israel.
I certainly hope so. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what logic is there in Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Frenchmen, or Germans boycotting Israel when the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans, and even the Saudis no longer view the boycott of Israel as an intelligent path forward. I mean, just the opposite. These Abraham Accords, as they're now called, say that Israel is a force for stability and prosperity in the region. It's an anchor of stability. It's an engine of creativity and ingenuity in so many fields, from food technology to cybersecurity, and from health and medicine to nuclear science. So it's impossible to deny that these accords place Israel in a completely different place, both in Arab discourse, and it should be in European discourse as well.
Yeah.
And then I want to add one thing, and maybe this is where you wanted to go. The Abraham Accords, named such, lend religious legitimacy to Arab-Israeli peace. They reference the common Abrahamic heritage of Arabs and Jews. And in some way, this implicitly acknowledges that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel.
Yep.
Now, this is a massive, massive transformation in the Arab approach to Israel. And that's something that ought to rub off.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk a little bit about your personal experience of the visit to Dubai. I talked with another Israeli who was there. He was picked up at the airport in a Rolls Royce and taken to a friend there who had like more than 20 cars in his garage or something. Did you spend a lot of time with you spent a lot of time with local leaders, I gather, and do you get a sense that they're all on board with this new move, or is there some internal opposition to it as well?
Okay, I'll start with the personal side and then try to answer your broader question. We had a fascinating experience because we had the chance to meet with and talk to many Emiratis, including women. You know, Emirati women dressed head to toe in their black gowns, the abaya, which is the black dress, and the shayla, which is their black headdress. I mean, my wife, who covers her head, her hair in the style of an Orthodox Jewish woman, was comparing how they tie their hairs together. I've got videos of her and these Emirati women with their hands, you know, comparing how they tie their hairstyle and what it means to them, and does it bother them, and how do they view themselves as religious women and as modern women at the same time. It was those type of one-on-one experiences that in many ways were most interesting. When you ask the broader question, we have to remember, certainly people in Israel or people in Norway, we live in democratic countries. None of the Gulf monarchies or emirates are democratic countries. I mean, these are dictatorships. In the case of Bahrain and the Emirates, they're benevolent dictatorships in the sense that they have this open-minded approach to the West, to Western education, and to religious tolerance. You'll see displays, Christmas displays in every hotel lobby and in every shopping mall in Dubai, which is something that really surprised me. And they were very happy to have us light the Hanukkah candelabra, the menorah, every place we went, whether we were out in the desert one evening or in the hotel lobby the next evening. But nobody has a real independent opinion in these countries other than the line dictated by the leadership. Now, again, as I said, at the moment, the leadership is benevolent and open-minded, so it works well, but there's also no crime in these countries. There's no murder, there's no theft, there's no rape, because the punishment for even lewd behavior in public is endless years in jail, and they have the entire country wired so that you can't get away with any tomfoolery, never mind criminal activity. It's very safe walk the streets of Dubai because of that. But don't step over the limits of the law, because if you do, you'll get clobbered. So it's not like there are a lot of Emirati or Bahraini think tanks with a wide range of opinion. And it's also, they're very small countries. We're talking 1 million, 1.5 million real citizens. The overwhelming numbers of people there are foreign workers, mostly Indians, Pakistanis, and Egyptians who come to work there, and they don't have a say in what goes on in the country anyways.
But do they, obviously you saw the foreign workers, they work as service people and workers, and are they free to talk to visitors, or
none of them will get into anything political with you?
No.
I mean, they're trained, they're taught to be open and welcoming. Certainly anybody who works in the travel, tourist, and hotel industries. There are millions of foreign workers in the construction industry. I mean, the construction boom in Dubai is amazing. They say that 30% of all the world's building cranes are in Dubai. And when you're there, you can believe it. I mean, there's skyscraper after skyscraper after skyscraper going up, and that's where the majority of the workers are. Obviously, we didn't talk to construction workers, nor would these be the type of people who regularly dabble in politics and matters of society and economy. So no, I can't say that we spoke to these people, but I will tell you that the foreign workers who work in the tourist industry are happy. They're there for 3 to 5 to 6 years on tourist visas. They're well paid, and they're pretty well treated, and they enjoy their lives there. Again, they come from countries where life is hard. So,
how do you think Emirati-Israeli relations will be, say, in 10 years?
I hope they will develop across the entire spectrum of cultural, scientific, economic, defense, and other foreign relations. I hope they will prove to be a model for better relations between Israel and other countries in the region. And I'm thinking first and foremost of Egypt and Jordan, who have been at peace formally with Israel for 30 and almost 50 years. And yet the peace between Israel and these two countries, Egypt and Jordan, has always been cold, very, very cold. It's been a relationship maintained at the political and diplomatic and military levels, but has not filtered down to the public. In fact, those governments haven't really tried to encourage the development of people-to-people relations. And again, in the case of these new accords, the situation is so different. With the green light from the leaderships of both countries, the businessmen and the tourist operators and the universities and the arts and cultural institutions have sought each other out. Israelis and Emiratis, Israelis and Bahrainis, and the relationship is booming. The banks are working with each other to facilitate the type of arrangements you need for real trade and investment ties. The airlines are flying back and forth. There are already 5 or 6 airlines, 3 Emiratis and 3 Israeli airlines on the Israel-Dubai route. We don't have any of that with Jordan and Egypt. Maybe there'll be a flight or 2 a week, and it's kept quiet. So there's a lot of room for our relations with our immediate Arab neighbors to improve based on the very positive and broad-ranging model that's already developing between Israel and the Gulf states. So I hope that we move in that direction. It depends on many things. Depends on how much Iran is allowed to continue its romp across the region, its hegemonic march across the region, seeking to destabilize the Gulf monarchies we've talked about, to undermine Saudi Arabia, to conquer vast tracts of land in Iraq and Syria to set themselves up in a forward terrorist attacking force on Israel's northern border in Syria and Lebanon, to continue feeding Hamas in the Gaza Strip on Israel's southern border with weaponry. It depends on how the international community operates to rein in the Iranians, and how much support the international community gives to the Gulf states and Israel in their new gambit for true relations of peace. And you can hear in my voice a note of concern that comes from the fact that, number one, some Western countries, particularly Europeans, have been less than welcoming of these new agreements between Israel and the Gulf countries, because it almost leaves the Palestinians at the wayside. Now, that, of course, in my opinion, is an absolutely wrong approach. If anything, the new accords between Israel and the Gulf countries make peace between Israel and the Palestinians more possible than ever, and open up new possibilities. If only the Palestinians would be willing to embrace this opportunity and work with the Gulf states to create a new negotiating table. This could be a great harbinger of a new era in Israeli-Palestinian relations as well. But unfortunately, that's not the approach that the Palestinians have taken thus far. And unfortunately, some European countries haven't seen it that way either. And of course, the second degree of concern relates to U.S. government policy. As we all know, 10 days from now, 15 days from now, there'll be a new president sitting in the White House who is explicitly committed to re-engaging the Iranians based on the old accord signed by President Obama, the accord known as the JCPOA. That's an accord that Israel and most of its Sunni Arab partners in this region did not like at the time it was signed. Today, feel even more strongly that accord was a great mistake. Feel strongly that dropping the sanctions that the Trump administration has built up against Iran would be a terrible mistake, and that just returning to that old accord would be a further mistake. So there are reasons for concern about how staunchly America will stand by Israel and America's Gulf Arab allies, who are now Israel's Gulf Arab allies, in confronting Iranian aggression. And that these things will have an enormous impact on the ability of Israel and other Arab states to develop their relations going forward.
År gamle Rina Schnerb ble drept av palestinske terrorister. Jentas drapsmenn vil resten av livet få utbetalt store summer av palestinske myndigheter. Palestinernes terrorlønn blir sponset av dine skattepenger. Hjelp oss å spre dette budskapet. Del denne videoen.
So we are back with David Weinberg. In a couple of months, Israel is facing the fourth election in 2 years. And maybe you could help us sort out the changes that have happened over the last weeks that caused the current coalition to break asunder, and many of our viewers will wonder if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be able to have another win in March, and so we want your opinion about that.
Okay, thank you for the question, Conrad. The truth is that this is somewhat of a embarrassing conversation for me to have with you, because the idea that Israel goes to the polls again and again with governments lasting only a few months before collapsing is somewhat of an embarrassment. It's also a problem because a country like Israel, with the great issues it has to deal with needs stability. And it's ironic as well because there aren't major differences. There are not major differences between Israel's mainstream political parties today on the big issues at play. There's no great difference between Israel's center-right and center-left about the need to confront Iranian aggression in the region. There's no difference between the major parties in Israel today over the way in which Israel needs to deal with the economic crisis brought on by COVID-19. Mm-hmm. There's no real difference between the major political parties today about the desirability of re-engaging with the Palestinians in some negotiated peace process, but not waiting for the Palestinians to come to their senses forever without moving forward and developing Israel's relations with the Arab world. And yet, our political system seems to break down over and over again, and that's for two reasons. Number one, because Prime Minister Netanyahu is under indictment and about to stand trial for a series of allegations of corruption. And that has made Netanyahu a controversial figure in Israeli politics. And the second reason is that we have a divided polity along ethnic and religious lines, where on average there are 12 to 13 to 14 political parties in a 120-seat Knesset, and every government ends up being a squabbling coalition. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether the next set of elections, this coming March, 2 months from now, will bring about a more stable coalition situation. I suspect that Netanyahu will get the first opportunity to form yet another coalition government. Will it be the type of coalition that will give him the immunity from prosecution that he's looking for? I doubt it. Mm-hmm. But he benefits from the fact that there aren't too many other leaders on the political spectrum right now that can boast his diplomatic and defense and economic achievements. So we may have political instability continuing going forward without a real change of leadership, at least for the next year or two. That's the most I'm willing to hazard a prediction at the moment.
Yeah. And the corona situation has even now the numbers are increasing, and there is talk of a third, or is it the fourth lockdown in Israel? How is this experience, say, in the community where you live, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem?
You know, in international comparative perspective, Israel has done quite well over the last year in confronting the corona crisis, in preventing the levels of infection and the mortality rate from growing too high. But, you know, when you live here, you look at your local situation, it doesn't give you great comfort to know that you're doing better than the Italians or better than the British or better than the Americans. You feel the noose around your neck, and Israelis unfortunately have a feeling that the government has flip-flopped and fumbled along the way. The numbers in Israel right now are extraordinarily high in terms of infection rates. We are going to apparently another lockdown, but at the same time, Israel has been first out the gate internationally in terms of getting its public vaccinated. As of today, 1.5 million Israelis have been vaccinated in less than 2 weeks. Yeah. And that's not just the elderly people over 80. I'm not quite 80 yet, and I've already been able to get vaccinated, and therefore there is hope that we may be coming out of this corona crisis faster than others. So it's a mixed picture.
Yeah. Yeah, Israel's success in vaccination has even made Norwegian journalists talk about Israel in a positive way, or keeping the Norwegian government accountable in comparison. David, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for talking to us, and all the best.
My honor and pleasure. I wish you and our listeners stay safe, be healthy, and as they say in English, keep your chin up. Better days are yet ahead, God willing.
Okay,
Hello from